Daniel, your mother betrayed us.
Mom, is this true?
Daniel, please.
Tell me the truth.
Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened to me. I was not a foolish woman. I was not naive, and I was not blind. I was simply a woman who believed that love, once it was given honestly, would be protected by the people who claimed to share it. I believed that when I married Daniel Whitfield, I was joining a family, not entering a war I hadn't been warned about. I was 29 years old, 5 months pregnant with our first child, and standing in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, holding a folder that was never meant to reach my hands. My gown was thin. My feet were bare against the cold tile. And inside that folder was proof that the woman who called herself my baby's grandmother had been trying, quietly and patiently, to make sure I never raised that child at all. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I certainly couldn't, not that night. 6 hours earlier, I had trusted this woman with my life and the life growing inside me. I had smiled at her jokes at Sunday dinners. I had thanked her for gifts I now understood were never really gifts. And in the space of one single evening, everything I thought I knew about my husband's mother collapsed into something I still struggle to say out loud. This is not a story about a difficult mother-in-law, the kind you complain about over coffee with your sister. This is a story about a woman who decided, long before I ever wore her son's ring, that I would not be allowed to keep what I was building with him. And she very nearly got away with it. But to understand how I ended up in that hallway, soaked in fear and fluorescent light, you have to go back to where it all began, back when my life still felt soft around the edges. Back before I understood that some of the people closest to us were their cruelty like perfume, so faint you don't notice it until you can't breathe. I taught art to third graders in a small elementary school outside Charleston, South Carolina, a job I chose not for the paycheck, but for the way children's faces lit up when they discovered they could make something beautiful with their own 2 hands. My classroom smelled like tempera paint and construction paper. And most afternoons the late sun would slant through the windows and land across rows of finger-painted sunflowers drying on a string above the chalkboard. I was 5 months along by then, and I had developed a habit I didn't even notice I was doing, resting my palm flat against my stomach whenever I paused to watch the children work, waiting for that small flutter of movement that told me she was still there, still safe, still mine. Daniel and I had been married for 2 years. He was an architect, 32 years old, with the kind of quiet steadiness that made people trust him within minutes of meeting him. He worked long hours downtown designing buildings that would outlive us both, and most evenings he came home with his tie already loosened and his sleeves pushed up past his elbows, exhausted in the particular way men get when they care deeply about doing their work well. But no matter how tired he was, no matter how long the day had been, he would walk through our front door, cross the kitchen in 4 long strides, kneel down in front of me, and press a kiss to my stomach before he ever kissed me. "Hey, little one," he'd murmur, like he was greeting someone who already mattered more than either of us. I used to think that was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. I still do, if I'm honest, even knowing everything that came after. Our apartment was small, but it was ours, filled with mismatched furniture we'd collected from estate sales, and a nursery we were slowly turning a soft, buttery yellow because we didn't want to know the baby's gender in advance. We just wanted to be surprised together. My younger sister Megan came by most weekends, teasing me mercilessly about my sudden craving for pickles dipped in orange juice, grounding our little family in laughter whenever the pregnancy made me anxious or tearful for no reason at all. Megan had a gift for saying exactly the thing that made a hard day feel lighter, and looking back now, she was the one person in my life who never once softened her instincts to keep the peace. She would become far more important to this story than either of us could have guessed that spring. There was only one detail in our happy little apartment that never quite sat right with me, and it was small enough that I dismissed it every single time. On the mantel above our unused fireplace sat a framed photograph of Daniel's mother, Patricia Whitfield, 58 years old, elegant in a way that seemed almost engineered, the kind of woman whose posture alone could quiet a room. I found myself straightening that frame every time I walked past it, adjusting it a fraction of an inch even when it hadn't moved, telling myself it was simply respect. Daniel's father had died young, leaving Patricia to raise her only son entirely on her own, and Daniel spoke about his mother's sacrifices with a tenderness I admired, even as some quiet, unexamined part of me flinched slightly every time her name came up in conversation. Now she wants to help during the pregnancy, Daniel told me one evening, almost apologetic, as though he already sensed I might not welcome the offer. I told him of course she can help. I meant it. I had no idea what that word, help, was about to cost me. The first Sunday dinner at the Whitfield family estate should have told me everything I needed to know, if I had been willing to see it clearly. The house sat behind a wrought iron gate, marble floors gleaming under chandelier light, so cold and precise it felt more like a museum than a home. Patricia greeted me at the door with a compliment about my dress, her eyes moving over me the way a jeweler examines a stone for flaws before deciding whether it's worth the setting. The table that evening held more silverware than I had ever used in my life, and I remember feeling, for the first time, that I was not being welcomed into this family so much as I was being evaluated for admission into it, an evaluation I had not agreed to and could not seem to pass no matter how graciously I smiled. Over dessert, Patricia made what she called a generous offer. She wanted to pay for a private specialist, a Dr. Alan Foster, whom she described as the finest obstetrician in the state, insisting that the hospital Daniel and I had already chosen together was, in her words, beneath what her grandchild deserved. Daniel, grateful and utterly oblivious to the current running beneath his mother's kindness, squeezed my hand under the table and encouraged me to accept. "I want the best for you and the baby," he whispered later that night, and I believed him completely, because it was true. What neither of us understood yet was that his mother's definition of the best had very little to do with me, and everything to do with control. I felt the first real sting of that control before dinner had even ended, though I wouldn't understand its full weight until much later. Patricia complimented the nursery colors I described to her. Then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned she had already ordered furniture from a designer she trusted more, furniture that would arrive within the week whether I wanted it or not. It was such a small thing, generosity dressed up as thoughtfulness. And yet I remember feeling strangely managed rather than cared for, the way you feel when someone rearranges your kitchen while you're out of the room and calls it a favor. I said nothing. I told myself I was being ungrateful, hormonal, too sensitive for a woman who had lost so much and was only trying to be involved in her grandchild's life. I would tell myself that same line many more times before the year was over. It was later that same evening, alone in the estate's guest bathroom, that I heard something through the door I was never supposed to hear. Patricia's voice, low and startlingly calm, carried from the hallway as she spoke on the phone to someone I couldn't identify. "She is not raising my grandchild to call some stranger grandma at every holiday," she said, each word measured and cold. "I'll handle it." I stood frozen at the sink, water running uselessly over my hands, telling myself I had misheard her, that the words meant something entirely different than what they sounded like. But a chill settled into my chest that night and never fully left, a small, persistent unease that would grow, week by week, into something I could no longer explain away. In the weeks that followed, Patricia's involvement stopped feeling like generosity and started feeling like something closer to a siege. She began appearing, unannounced, at my ultrasound appointments, answering Dr. Foster's questions before I had the chance to speak, as though my own pregnancy were a project she had been assigned to manage. She mentioned to friends at a luncheon that my due date was several weeks off from what it actually was, a small inconsistency that somehow spread through her social circle until I found myself correcting well-meaning strangers at the grocery store. I started feeling dizzy in the afternoons, a heavy, disorienting nausea that didn't match the steady rhythm of my previous checkups, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had started around the same time Patricia had a new bottle of prenatal vitamins delivered to our apartment as a gift, insisting the brand I'd been using wasn't strong enough for a Whitfield grandchild. Rosa, the housekeeper who had worked in the Whitfield household for nearly 20 years, began giving me long, searching looks whenever Patricia wasn't watching, the kind of look that carries a warning a person is too frightened to say out loud. I noticed it the way you notice a shadow crossing a room, present and gone before you can name it. Rosa had a gentleness in her face that reminded me of my own grandmother, and more than once I caught her opening her mouth as if to speak, only to glance toward the hallway and close it again. I didn't push her. I told myself whatever she was carrying wasn't my business, another lie I would come to regret. Daniel, caught between the two women he loved most, dismissed my growing unease as stress, as hormones, as the natural anxiety of a first pregnancy. It wasn't cruelty on his part, I want to be clear about that. It was blindness born from 32 years of trusting his mother completely, and I understood even then how difficult it must have been for him to imagine her capable of anything but love. But his dismissal isolated me in a way I hadn't expected marriage to ever make me feel, alone in a house full of people who claimed to care for me. One evening, I finally said the words out loud at the estate, told Patricia plainly that something about her involvement felt wrong. She didn't flinch. She looked at me with the same unblinking calm she wore like armor and said, "Every mother who has ever loved her son has had to save him from the wrong woman once." I drove home alone that night in the rain, one hand gripping the wheel, the other pressed protectively over my stomach, crying in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry in months. The proof I needed came from the person I least expected to give it to me. Rosa found me alone in the estate's kitchen on a gray afternoon, her hands trembling as she pressed a torn pharmacy receipt into mine, a prescription filled under my name at a pharmacy I had never once visited. I stared at it for a long moment before the fear finally settled into something sharper, something closer to certainty. When I brought the receipt to Dr. Foster, his face went pale in a way that told me everything before he even spoke. He admitted, haltingly, that Mrs. Whitfield had contacted him directly requesting changes to my prenatal medication, changes he'd assumed had been discussed with me first, because why would he ever have imagined otherwise? The dizziness, the missed appointments, the quiet confusion that had followed me for months, none of it had been coincidence. It had all been engineered by a woman I had once thanked for her kindness. I was faced, that week, with a choice I never imagined I would have to make. I could expose Patricia and shatter the image Daniel had carried of his mother his entire life, the only parent he had left, the woman who had raised him alone through every hardship. Or I could stay silent and risk the safety of the daughter growing inside me. I chose my daughter. I packed a small bag with shaking hands in a hotel room 3 miles from our apartment, and I began writing everything down in a notebook. The receipt, the pharmacy records, the overheard phone call I could still hear clearly in my memory though months had passed. That notebook, that gathering of quiet, terrified evidence, would become the very folder I was holding the night this story began, the night everything finally came into the light. That night arrived faster than I expected. The stress of those final weeks sent my body into early labor, sharp and sudden, and Daniel drove me to the hospital with a panic in his voice I had never heard from him before. He arrived at my bedside frantic, still in his work clothes, and it was there, in that same hallway I described to you at the very beginning, that Rosa finally found the courage she had been carrying for months. She placed the folder in Daniel's hands herself, a folder that held more than even I had known, hospital security footage showing Patricia switching the bottles of my prenatal vitamins with her own hands, and a voicemail, saved and forwarded by Rosa months earlier out of quiet, desperate foresight, of Patricia speaking to her late husband's lawyer about ensuring the baby carried the Whitfield name without, in her exact words, that girl attached to it. Daniel stood outside the delivery room and listened to his mother's voice on that recording while I fought, just down the hallway, to bring our daughter safely into the world. I have never asked him exactly what that moment felt like, hearing the woman who raised him confess, in her own voice, to a plan that had begun months before I ever became pregnant, a plan that revealed her interference was never protection at all, but a calculated campaign to remove me entirely from my husband and my child's life. Our daughter, Ava, was born healthy just after dawn, and the sound of her first cry is the only thing from that night I can remember without pain. Daniel confronted his mother in the hospital corridor within the hour, his voice breaking with an anger I had genuinely never witnessed in him before, dismantling, in a matter of minutes, a lifetime of quiet deference to a woman who had never once been questioned. Patricia, for the first time since I had known her, let her composure slip, though not into remorse. What emerged instead was something closer to justification, rooted in her own fear of being replaced, her own grief dressed up as protection. Daniel drew a boundary that night that has held firm ever since, supervised and earned contact only. Full transparency between us from that point forward, no more secrets disguised as generosity. Rosa was thanked properly, finally, folded into our trust the way she had always deserved to be, her quiet courage rewarded after months of silent fear. And I did not seek revenge, holding my daughter for the first time, feeling her weight settle against my chest like she had always belonged there. I sought only safety and peace, and the kind of honesty our small family had been missing for far too long. Months later, our nursery finally finished in that soft, buttery yellow we had chosen together so long ago. I sit most evenings with Ava asleep in my arms, watching the last of the sunlight move slowly across her wall. Daniel comes home tired but lighter now, kneeling to kiss us both the way he always has, and Patricia, I'm told, has begun the slow, imperfect work of understanding why she couldn't let go. I write in a journal for my daughter some nights, when the house is quiet, trying to put into words the one thing I hope she carries with her long after I'm gone. That love only survives the people who threaten it when it's protected by honesty instead of silence. I didn't tell Daniel everything at once. Grief and fury need room to breathe before they can hold the full shape of a betrayal. And I watched my husband absorb his mother's confession in pieces over the days that followed, the way a person tests a wound to see how deep it actually goes. He sat at our kitchen table one night with a notebook open in front of him, reading through months of my careful, frightened handwriting, and I watched something in his face rearrange itself permanently. He wasn't just angry at what his mother had done to me. He was grieving the version of her he had spent 32 years believing in, the widow who had sacrificed everything, the woman who had never, not once, given him a reason to doubt her. Losing that version of Patricia was its own kind of death, and I sat beside him that night not as a wife defending herself, but as a partner watching the man I loved bury someone who was still very much alive. Megan arrived at the hospital the morning after Ava was born carrying a diaper bag she had clearly packed in a hurry and a look on her face that told me she already knew everything before I said a word. Rosa had called her, my sister, who had spent years making jokes to keep our family light during hard seasons, did not make a single joke that morning. She simply climbed onto the edge of my hospital bed, wrapped her arms around both me and the baby, and said the only thing that mattered in that moment, "You're safe now, both of you, I've got you." Megan had never trusted Patricia, not from the very first Sunday dinner 2 years earlier, and there was no satisfaction in her voice when the truth finally surfaced, only relief. The particular relief of watching someone you love finally believed after months of being told she was imagining things. The confrontation between Daniel and his mother did not end in the hospital corridor the way these moments sometimes do in the stories we tell ourselves. It continued for weeks, in phone calls Daniel took behind closed doors, in a single supervised meeting at a lawyer's office where Patricia was asked, plainly, to explain the voicemail Rosa had preserved. She did not deny it. That, more than anything else, told Daniel everything he needed to know about how long this had truly been building. Patricia did not see herself as someone who had done something monstrous. She saw herself as a mother who had been protecting her son from a stranger, even after 2 years of marriage, even after watching me build an entire life beside him. Her failure to see me as anything other than a threat to be managed was, in its own way, more devastating than the vitamins, more devastating than the forged prescription, because it meant none of it had ever really been about me at all. It had always, only, been about her fear of becoming unnecessary. I think often about the woman I was before that year, the one who straightened a photograph on a mantle out of habit and told herself it meant nothing. I don't blame that version of myself for missing the signs, because the signs were never meant to be obvious. Patricia was patient in a way that cruelty rarely allows itself to be, spacing her interference out just far enough that each individual moment could be explained away, dismissed, forgiven. It is a particular kind of loneliness, realizing that the danger closest to you wore the same warm smile at every holiday dinner, complimented your dress, called you dear. I have talked with other women since, in the years after Ava was born, who described the same slow erosion in their own families, the same quiet insistence disguised as love, and I have come to understand that my story, as frightening as it was, is not as rare as I once believed. Daniel and I did not choose to cut Patricia out of our lives entirely, and there were people in our circle who didn't understand that decision, who thought forgiveness of any kind was too generous an answer to what she had done. But Daniel needed to know, for his own peace, whether his mother was capable of change, and I needed, for Ava's sake, to model something other than permanent war. The supervised visits began small, 30 minutes at a time, always with Rosa or Megan present, always with Daniel watching closely for the smallest sign that nothing had truly shifted. Slowly, painfully, something did begin to shift. Not all at once, and not completely, but enough that I no longer flinch when her name comes up in conversation the way I once did. Ava is walking now, unsteady and delighted with herself, chasing Rosa around our kitchen most Sunday afternoons while Daniel and I watch from the doorway, his hand resting on the small of my back the same way it always has. I think about that hospital hallway less often than I used to, though I doubt I'll ever forget the particular cold of that tile beneath my bare feet, or the weight of that folder in my hands, or the sound of rain against the window while I waited to learn whether the people who loved me would believe what I had found. What I know now, that I didn't know then, is that protecting your child sometimes means becoming someone your own family doesn't recognize, someone quieter, more careful, more willing to gather evidence in a hotel room at midnight than to keep smiling through dinners that made your skin crawl. I don't regret a single hour of it. There is one more piece of this story I haven't told you yet, because I needed enough distance from it before I could put it into words without my hands shaking. About 8 months after Ava's birth, I received a letter from Patricia, not an email, not a text, an actual handwritten letter, delivered to our apartment while Daniel was at work. I almost didn't open it. I sat with it on the kitchen table for 2 full days, staring at her familiar, precise handwriting on the envelope, before I finally sat down with a cup of tea I never drank and read what she had to say. It wasn't an apology, not in the way I had once imagined an apology from her might sound. Patricia was not a woman built for that kind of surrender. Instead, it was an accounting, almost clinical in its honesty, of the year her husband died, and the fear that had taken root in her afterward, a fear that Daniel, her only remaining tether to the life she had built, would eventually be taken from her too, piece by piece, the way everything else had been. She wrote that she had convinced herself, somewhere along the way, that loving Daniel meant never being replaced in his life, and that any woman who loved him as deeply as I did became, in her mind, someone to be defeated rather than welcomed. She did not ask me to forgive her. She asked me to understand that fear, left alone long enough in a person, will eventually disguise itself as love and convince even the person carrying it that it was never anything but devotion. I read that letter 3 times before I showed it to Daniel, and when I finally did, he read it standing in our kitchen with Ava asleep against his shoulder, and I watched tears move down his face for the first time since the night at the hospital. He didn't say much afterward. He simply held our daughter a little tighter and told me, quietly, that he was grateful I had been strong enough to protect her when he hadn't yet understood there was anything to protect her from. I think that admission cost him more than any confrontation ever could have, because it meant accepting that the 2 women he loved most had once stood on opposite sides of a war, and that for a long time, without meaning to, he had been standing on the wrong side of it. Patricia's therapy continued longer than any of us expected, well past the 6 months her lawyer had originally suggested, and somewhere around the 2-year mark, Daniel began inviting her to small, ordinary moments, a Sunday lunch, a school recital once Ava was old enough for those, always with someone else present, always with the quiet understanding that trust, once broken that severely, has to be rebuilt one small, honest gesture at a time, rather than restored all at once through a single, grand reconciliation. I won't pretend it is comfortable, watching her hold my daughter's hand now. Some small, old part of me still tightens whenever they're in a room together. But I no longer feel the need to watch her the way I once did, counting every glance, listening for hidden meaning behind every compliment. That vigilance, exhausting as it was necessary, has finally begun to loosen its grip on me. Rosa still works for the family, though her role has shifted into something closer to what she always deserved: respected, trusted completely, treated as the woman who told the truth when it would have been so much easier, so much safer for her own position, to stay silent. I make a point of telling Ava, even now while she's too young to fully understand it, that Rosa is the reason our family survived that year intact. That courage sometimes looks like a torn receipt pressed quietly into someone's palm in a kitchen, rather than anything loud or dramatic. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: love that requires your silence to survive was never really love at all. It was control wearing love's clothing. And the two are not nearly as similar as the people benefiting from your silence would like you to believe. I nearly lost my marriage, my peace, and very nearly my daughter's safety to a woman who genuinely believed, until the very end, that she was acting out of devotion. What saved us wasn't confrontation alone, and it wasn't forgiveness alone either. It was honesty, relentless and uncomfortable, refusing to let a single lie stand simply because the person telling it claimed to love us.